everyone, and welcome to Storytime with Jocelyn, part 2 of Cinderella. Bippity boppity boo! Aren't you excited? Well, Jocelyn is. She's ready to hear what happens after the dress was made. Does Cinderella get to go to the ball? Let's find out. Let's get started. Chapter 7. As evening fell, every maiden in the kingdom was bustling with excitement. Every maiden except one, that is. Cinderella stood in the upstairs hall, gazing forlornly out the window. She had finally managed to finish her chores. There had been no time for her to fix her dress, and the carriage was due to arrive at any moment to take Lady Tremaine and her daughters to the ball. Cinderella sighed. Oh, it just didn't seem fair. She worked so hard and asked so little. But there was no sense in spending any more time wishing for something that wasn't to be. She was about to turn away from the window when she heard the click-clock of horses' hoofs approaching. As the sound grew louder, a gleaming black carriage being pulled by a proud white horse came into view and stopped in front of the chateau. Cinderella sighed, left the window, and headed down the hall. "The carriage is here," she announced, knocking softly on her stepmother's door. Poor Cinderella. "Why, Cinderella," Lady Tremaine said as she opened the door. She looked her stepdaughter up and down, pretending to be surprised. "You aren't dressed for the ball." "I'm not going," Cinderella nearly whispered. "I didn't have time to fix my dress." "Oh, what a shame," her stepmother said. She turned and smiled triumphantly at Drusilla and Anastasia, who were primping by the mirror. They smirked back. "But of course, there will be other times," Lady Tremaine added, turning back to face Cinderella. "Yes," Cinderella said, fighting back tears. "Good night." Cinderella hurried upstairs to her room. She couldn't bear to stay downstairs and watch her stepsisters and her stepmother leave for the ball, the wonderful magical ball that Cinderella herself was going to miss. Without turning on the light, she walked straight to the window and stared out at the palace on the horizon. "Oh, well, what's a royal ball?" she said out loud into the darkness. "After all, I suppose it would be frightfully dull and boring and completely wonderful," she admitted sadly. Suddenly, the room lit up behind her as Cinderella spun around in surprise. 2 bluebirds circled the room. Then they pushed back a screen to reveal the most beautiful dress Cinderella had ever seen. "Oh my goodness!" she said, stunned. "Why, it's my surprise!" The mice squealed, popped up in their hiding places. "Surprise!" the birds chirped. Cinderella was speechless. Could it be? Might she be able to go to the ball after all? "Why, I never dreamed!" she finally cried out. "This is such a wonderful surprise." Holding the dress in front of her, she smiled at her friends and murmured, "How could I ever thank you?" Moments later, Cinderella was dressed in her most beautiful new gown. She glanced out the window. The coach was still there, and she wasn't too late. "Wait!" she cried, hurrying down the stairs. "Please, wait for me!" Lady Tremaine and her daughters were nearly out the door when Cinderella caught up to them. "Isn't it lovely?" Cinderella explained, twirling before them so that her skirt of her gown swirled around her. "Do you like it? Do you think it will do?" Anastasia and Drusilla glared at Cinderella. "Mother!" both girls cried. "She can't!" Anastasia howled. "She wouldn't!" Drusilla shrieked. "Girls, girls, please!" Lady Tremaine shouted. "After all," she said more calmly, We did make a bargain. She took a step towards Cinderella and stared straight into her eyes. Didn't we? Cinderella smiled uncertainly. And I never go back on my word. Her stepmother muttered thoughtfully, looking long and hard at Cinderella's dress. How very clever, these beads. They give it just the right touch. Don't you think so? She said sharply, turning to Drusilla. No, I don't, Drusilla said grumpily. I think she's... Suddenly, Drusilla's jaw dropped as she recognized the beads she'd thrown away. Why, you little thief! She screeched at Cinderella. They're my beads! Give them here! Drusilla reached out and ripped the beads right off Cinderella's neck. And that's my sash! She's wearing my sash! Anastasia shouted, tearing the sash from Cinderella's waist, Jocelyn. Cinderella stood between the sisters, dazed. Oh no, please don't! But her two stepsisters continued to tear her dress apart. Drusilla grabbed a handful of the skirt. You horrible sneak! She screamed. Anastasia yanked at a seam. Ungrateful wretch! She shrieked. They pawed and pulled, they tugged and wrenched, they clawed and scratched, until Cinderella stood wearing only pink tatters and shreds. Look how sad Cinderella looks. Chapter 8. Blinded by tears, Cinderella ran out of the house and across the yard, past the horse, past Bruno the dog, past Gus and Jock and all her friends. When she finally reached the garden, she threw herself down on the bench in the shadows under a willow and buried her face in her arms. She had never felt so hopeless. She vowed then and there not to believe in dreams anymore, or in happiness or hope either. Instead, she resigned herself to living a miserable life, a drudgery and pain. Poor Cinderella. It's just no use, she sobbed. No use at all. There's nothing left to believe in. Nothing. Nothing, my dear? A mellifluous voice asked. Oh, now you don't really mean that. Oh, but I do, Cinderella insisted. She lifted her head and caught her breath. A moment ago, the garden had been dark and deserted, but now a smiling white-haired woman was seated on the bench, surrounded by a circle of sparkling light. The woman helped Cinderella to her feet. Ha ha ha! What do you think's gonna happen? Wiping a tear from Cinderella's face, she said, Nonsense, child. If you had lost all of your faith, I couldn't be here. But as you can see, here I am. Now dry those tears. You can't go to the ball looking like that. The ball? Cinderella repeated, tears welling up in her eyes again. I'm not going to the ball. Of course you are, the woman assured her cheerfully. But we have to hurry. Even miracles take a little time, you know. Cinderella shook her head in confusion. Miracles, she asked. Just watch, the woman said brightly. She paused, and puzzled look across her face. Now what in the world did I do with my magic wand? Magic wand? Cinderella repeated in amazement. Why, then you must be your fairy godmother, of course. The woman finished for her. Then with a wave of her hand, she magically produced a wand from thin air. Now, let's see, she went on. I'd say the first thing you need is... Her eyes scanned the garden. A pumpkin. A pumpkin? Cinderella repeated doubtfully. She had been unexpecting the woman to say something about her ruined gown. Now for the magic words, the fairy godmother said. What are the magic words out there? She turned toward a big round pumpkin at the edge of the garden and waved her wand. Oh, yes, I remember. Salicadoola, mechicadoola, pippity poppity poo. Cinderella could hardly believe what happened next. As the fairy godmother waved her wand and sang out the magic words, the pumpkin shivered and jumped and expanded, and suddenly, with a jolt, the ordinary pumpkin was transformed into a magnificent, gleaming, extraordinary coach. Cinderella gasped, ah! And she heard smaller gasps all around her. Ah, 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 he. Wow. She saw that all her animal friends had gathered from the house and barnyard. They looked as amazed as she was at what they had just seen. But the fairy godmother wasn't finished yet. Now, she continued, to draw an elegant coach like that, of course, we'll simply have to have, and letting her gaze roam around and then past the family's eager-looking horse, she concluded, mice! With another wave of her wand and some more magic words, she turned Gus, Jock, and 2 other mice into sleek horses. Now, where were we? Oh, goodness, yes. You can't go to the ball without a coachman. With that, she turned the horse into a well-dressed coachman. Then she turned Bruno. As for you, you'll be a footman tonight, she said, and the big brown dog was changed into just that. The fairy godmother turned to Cinderella and, well, hop in, my dear. We mustn't waste time. Cinderella hesitated and looked down at her torn dress. But, now don't try to thank me, the fairy godmother said. Oh, I wasn't, Cinderella began, still astonished at the magic she had just witnessed. I mean, I do, she added quickly. But don't you think my dress? The fairy godmother finally took a look at Cinderella's tattered gown. I know, Jocelyn, it was an ugly thing, wasn't it? And let out a shriek of dismay, just like Jocelyn just did. Goodness gracious. Good heavens, child, she explained. You can't go in that. Cinderella smiled and shook her head. One last time, the fairy godmother fluttered her magic wand and sang out the magic words, and suddenly Cinderella felt the force of the fairy godmother's magic surrounding her. She looked down and saw that the tattered remains of her pink dress had been transformed into a stunning, shimmering, silvery gown that gleamed in the moonlight. With matching long gloves, a black velvet choker, and a sparkling diamond tiara, Cinderella looked like a princess. On her feet were a pair of dainty glass slippers. She rushed over to admire her reflection in a nearby fountain, and Cinderella had never felt so beautiful. She felt her heart fill up once again with hope and faith and delight. Why, it's like a dream, a wonderful dream come true. Yes, my child, the fairy godmother said tenderly, but like all dreams, I'm afraid this one can't last forever. You'll only have until midnight. And then midnight? Cinderella cried gratefully. Oh, thank you. You must understand, my dear, the fairy godmother continued. Seriously, on the 12th stroke of midnight, the spell will be broken and everything will be as it was before. I understand, Cinderella said happily, but it's so much more than I ever hoped for. Bless you, my child, the fairy godmother smiled and waved Cinderella into the coach. Doesn't Cinderella look beautiful? Can you spot Bruno the dog? What was Bruno the dog turned into? The footman! Chapter 9. The grand ballroom of the palace was crowded with dozens of exciting young maidens from all over the kingdom. As each young lady entered the hall, The royal chamberlain announced her and introduced her to the handsome young prince who stood on a dais at one end of the room. As maiden after maiden came in and curtsied, the prince found himself sniffling and yawning after yawn. He couldn't understand why his father was making such a fuss over him by hosting this ball, or why the king was so eager to introduce him to all these young ladies. The prince didn't have any trouble meeting young ladies on his own. He just had trouble meeting anyone he felt he could care about. He raised a hand to cover yet another yawn. The chamberlain cleared his throat as the next two young ladies approached the dais. The Mademoiselles Drusilla and Anastasia Tremaine, daughters of Lady Tremaine, he announced. The prince bowed politely to the two homely girls who were practically tripping over their own feet as they curtsied. As he straightened up again, his gaze wandered past them to another young lady who had just entered at the far end of the hall and was looking around uncertainly. He stared, transfixed. She was the most beautiful girl he had ever seen. She was wearing a shimmering gown and a sparkling tiara. Her golden hair was piled atop her head and framed her lovely face. The prince suddenly had the feeling that this night might not turn out to be hopelessly boring after all. He stepped down from the dais and pushed his way down the startled Anastasia and Drusilla, his eyes never leaving the maiden in the silvery gown, Jocelyn. Cinderella was overwhelmed by the beauty and the grandeur of the palace. She felt almost dizzy as she looked around. The sound of rapidly approaching footsteps brought her back to reality. She looked up and caught her breath as she found herself gazing into the deep brown eyes of a tall, broad-shouldering young gentleman. Do you think she knows that that's the prince? When he gave her a kind smile, I know, you think she does? You think she knows that's the prince, Jocelyn? When he gave her a kind smile and politely asked her to dance, Cinderella was astonished. She could hardly believe she was already being asked to dance, especially by someone so handsome. She had been hoping to get a look at the prince, but she decided that she could wait. So she doesn't know that this is the prince. Can you spot Cinderella in the picture? She was sure that even the prince couldn't possibly be any more handsome than this charming young man. She returned his smile and gave him her hand. As the gentleman kissed her hand and swept her off into the waltz, Cinderella felt as though she really were living a dream. No, it was even better than a dream. It was as if she and this handsome stranger had been dancing together forever. As she knew without his saying, so that he felt the same way, without even knowing each other's name, the two young people were quickly falling in love. As the young couple swayed wordlessly to the music, the other guests looked on, some with pleasure and some with envy. "Who is she, Mother?" Anastasia asked previously. Drusilla was trying to get a good look at the prince's partner, but such a crowd was gathered that she could catch only a brief glimpse of her. "Do we know her?" she added. "I know, I've seen her before," Anastasia said. With narrowed eyes, Lady Tremaine watched the couple dance. "There is something familiar about her," she said slowly. She looked her daughters and moved through the crowd, and she left. trying to get a closer look. But a moment later, the prince led his partner out of the room and toward the royal gardens. Lady Tremaine tried to follow, but found her path blocked by the Grand Duke, who had been ordered by the king to see that the young couple had all the privacy they needed. Frustrated, Lady Tremaine returned to the ballroom, puzzling over her strange feeling that she'd seen the beautiful young lady somewhere before. Meanwhile, Cinderella and the prince danced across the terrace and then walked hand in hand into the moonlit garden. They strolled across a romantic little bridge, pausing in the middle to watch the sparkling water drifting by below. Cinderella looked up, Jocelyn, at the handsome young man, her eyes filled with the same love she could see reflected in his own. A moment later, their lips met in a long and tender kiss, Jocelyn. They were interrupted by the sound of a chime from the clock tower. Cinderella broke away from the prince's embrace and glanced at the clock, startled. "Oh my goodness," she exclaimed. "It's midnight." She realized she had completely lost track of the time. At the 12th stroke of the clock, all the fairy godmother's magic would be undone. "Yes, so it is," the prince replied, "but—" "Goodbye," Cinderella whispered, tearing away from the embrace. "No, wait, you can't go now," the prince protested. "But I must," Cinderella replied as the clock struck again. "Please, I must." "But why?" the prince asked, confused by her urgency. Cinderella desperately searched her mind for an excuse. "Well, I haven't met the prince yet," she stammered. She turned and rushed off through the gardens toward the palace. The prince stared after her. "The prince?" he repeated with a puzzled frown. "But didn't you know?" Could she really have not known that he was the prince? "Wait, come back," he called, rushing after her. "Oh, please come back. I don't even know your name. How will I find you?" As the clock stroke continued to strike, Cinderella reached the palace and rushed through the ballroom past the Grand Duke, who had dozed off while guarding the door to the garden. He woke with a start. "Oh, I say, young lady, wait!" The Grand Duke joined the prince in his chase, but Cinderella was already hurrying down the wide front steps of the palace toward her waiting coach. She held up her skirt so she wouldn't trip, but as she ran, one foot suddenly came out of its glass slipper. Cinderella turned to retrieve the shoe, but just when she saw the Grand Duke burst through the door, she ran toward her. Can you spot the glass slipper? Jocelyn knows where it is. "Oh, bless me," he gasped. "Young lady, just a moment." Cinderella turned and ran, leaving the slipper lying where it had fallen on the steps. As the Grand Duke shouted for the guards to follow her, she threw herself into the carriage and sped off into the night. Down the winding hill and over a rickety bridge, the carriage collapsed, widely pursued by the king's garden, and Cinderella could hear the palace clock as it continued its striking. 9, 10, 11. At the stroke of midnight, the spell was instantly broken. The coach turned back into a pumpkin and the horses into mice. Bruno and the horse returned to their usual forms as well. Hearing the guards approaching, Cinderella and her animal friends jumped into the brush beside the road, shaking but not unharmed. The pumpkin was not so lucky. The thundering hooves of the guards' horses smashed it into 1,000 pieces, and they sped onto the road. To Cinderella's relief, the guards didn't see her. "I'm sorry," Cinderella told her friends after the guards had passed. "I guess I forgot about everything, even the time. But it was so wonderful, Jocelyn. And he was so handsome. And when we danced..." She sighed at the memory. "I'm sure the prince himself couldn't have been more charming." She sighed again sadly. "And I don't even know his name. I'll probably never see him again." She looked down at her tattered old dress and saw, peeking out from under the skirt, one bare foot and one sparkling glass slipper. Cinderella gasped and reached down to remove the slipper. She cradled it gently in her hands, overjoyed to have a memento of the most marvelous evening of her life. She looked up at the starry sky, thinking of the kind fairy godmother who had made it all possible. "Thank you," she cried, overjoyed. "Thank you so very much for everything." Chapter 10. The next morning, the Grand Duke stood nervously outside the king's bedroom. Summoning all his courage, he knocked gingerly on the door. The king had left the ball soon after the prince and Cinderella had started dancing, so he didn't yet know about the girl's hasty exit. The Grand Duke wished more than anything that he didn't have to be the one to give the king the news. "Come in," the king called. The Grand Duke slowly opened the door and peeked inside. The king sat up in bed and wiped the sleep from his eyes. When he saw the Grand Duke, he jumped out of bed. "So has he proposed already?" he asked jubilantly. "Tell me all about it. Who is she? Where does she live?" Well, the Grand Duke stammered. "I didn't get a chance to. No matter. We have more important things to discuss. Arrangements for the wedding, invitation, all those sorts of things." The Grand Duke gulped. But, here, have a cigar," the king said, shoving one into the Grand Duke's mouth. "To celebrate the marriage of my son and your knighthood." "Knighthood?" the Grand Duke repeated, tears welling in his eyes. He couldn't stand it any longer. He had to tell the king the truth. "Sire, she got away," he blurted out. The king's face turned crimson as the meaning of the words sank in. "She what?" he blowed. "I tried to stop her," the Grand Duke cried, "but she vanished into thin air." "A likely story," the king said, rushing across the room and grabbing his sword. "But it's true, sire," the Grand Duke insisted, his hands trembling as he pulled out the slipper he had picked up from the steps. "All we could find was this glass slipper." "The whole thing was a plot," the king shouted, swiping viciously at the Grand Duke with his sword. The Grand Duke ducked. "But your son loves her," he explained quickly. "He won't rest until he finds her. He's determined to marry her." The king's expression softened. "He what?" "The prince swears that he'll marry none but the girl who fits this." The Grand Duke held out the glass slipper in his shaking hand. The king snatched the slipper and kissed it. He paused and scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Then," he said finally, "you will try this on every maiden in the land. And as soon as you find one this shoe fits, we will have the biggest wedding this kingdom has ever seen." The king was mad. It didn't take long for the news to spread. Lady Tremaine rushed to wake Anastasia and Drusilla the moment she heard about the slipper. Cinderella was preparing breakfast when she heard her stepmother shouting, "Get up, quick, this instant! Anastasia, Drusilla, we haven't a moment to lose." Cinderella hurried to finish her task, curious to discover what the fuss was about. There was such a commotion that even the mice peeked out from their holes in curiosity, Jocelyn. I know. Anastasia groggily sat up in bed as her mother bustled about the room, opening the drapes and grabbing clothes from the closet. "Huh? What's going on?" she asked with a yawn. Everyone's talking about it, her mother said. The whole kingdom, hurry now. He'll be here any minute. Who? Drusilla asked. She was standing in the doorway, stretching herself sheepishly. The Grand Duke. He's hunting for that girl, the one who lost her slipper at the ball last night. Lady Tremaine explained, just as Cinder arrived at the door with the tea trays. They say the prince is madly in love with her. Crash! The breakfast trays slipped from Cinderella's hands and onto the floor, Jocelyn. You smiling about that? She gasped and brought her hand to her mouth. He was the prince? She whispered to herself. You clumsy little fool, her stepmother cried. Clean that up and help my daughter's dress. What for? Drusilla said. That's right, Anastasia agreed grumpily. If he's in love with that girl, what good does getting dressed up to do for us? Cinderella absent-mindedly started to pick up the mess, still stunned at the news that her handsome stranger was the prince. Now you two listen to me, Lady Tremaine told her daughters sharply. There's still a chance that one of you could get him. No one, not even the prince, knows who that girl is. Gus and Jacques were watching and listening. We know, Gus squeaked excitingly. It's Cinderella! Jack squashed him, anxiously to hear every word. The glass slipper is their only clue, Lady Tremaine continued. The Grand Duke has been ordered to try it on every girl in the kingdom. And if one can be found whom the slipper fits, then by the king's command, that girl shall be the prince's bride. His bride? The two sisters shrieked. His bride? Cinderella echoed softly in awe. Cinderella! You must get my things together right away, Drusilla commanded. Never mind her, Cinderella, Anastasia said. She ran around the room, wildly gathering up clothes. Mend these now! Not until she irons my dress, Drusilla said. Soon both girls began tossing heaps of clothing into Cinderella's arms, and Cinderella stood motionless, staring off into space with a dreamy expression on her face. Such wonderful thoughts were whirling around her head that she could hardly take them all in. She had to be dreaming, she decided. What's the matter with her? Anastasia said irritably, noticing Cinderella's distracted expression. Wake up, stupid! We've got to get dressed! Drusilla snapped. At the sound of her stepmother's voices, Cinderella snapped out of her ravine. With a burst of happiness, she realized that she wasn't dreaming after all. It was all true. The gentle, handsome, charming prince really wanted to marry her. Dressed? Cinderella said joyfully. Oh, yes, we must get dressed. Without another word, Cinderella dropped the combing and left the room, humming the tune of the waltz from the previous night. Mother, did you see what she did? Drusilla whined. Are we just going to let her walk out? Anastasia demanded. Quiet, the mother said, staring after Cinderella with narrowed eyes. She recognized that tune from the ball. Could it be? She thought. She left the room and headed down the hall toward the staircase Cinderella had just climbed. In her room, Cinderella was standing at her mirror, combing her hair, still humming. Finally, my dreams are to come true, she thought hysterically. After all these years of suffering, she would be happy at last. Cinderella flashed a glorious smile to the mice who had gathered around her. Just then, Cinderella looked up called her stepmother's reflection in the mirror. Her stepmother was standing at the bedroom door, her eyes dark, her mouth twisted in a snarl. As Cinderella spun around, startled, she heard the sound of the door slamming and the clink of a key in the lock. Cinderella raced across the room, Jocelyn, and pulled at the door, but it wouldn't budge. Her stepmother had locked her in, Jocelyn. "Please," Cinderella begged. "You can't do this. You just can't." She threw herself against the door, crying, "Let me out! She must let me out!" Doesn't she look horribly evil? She'll get what's coming to her. Chapter 11. Jacques and Gus watched the other mice as Cinderella sobbed brokenheartedly. "We've got to get that key," Jacques said with determination. "We've just got to." The two mice slipped under the door and quietly followed Lady Tremaine downstairs. "Mother, he's here," Drusilla cried excitedly. "Oh, do I look all right?" Anastasia asked, primping at the mirror. Drusilla elbowed her sister aside. "What about me?" "Girls," their mother said, "now remember, this is your last chance. Don't fail me." She hurried to open the door. A royal footman stood at the threshold, announcing His Imperial Grace, the Grand Duke. The footman waved the Grand Duke in with a flourish. Lady Tremaine smiled and bowed. "May I present my daughters, Drusilla and Anastasia." The Grand Duke peered at the ugly stepsisters and shuddered. "Ugh. Charmed, I'm sure," he said. What do you think is under this? Let's find out. But in reality, he was already quite certain that neither of these homely creatures could be the young lady with whom the prince had waltzed the night before. See, he's smart. "His Grace will read a royal proclamation," the footman announced. He pulled the scroll from his pocket, unrolled it, and held it up from the Grand Duke to read. The Grand Duke cleared his throat. "All subjects of His Imperial Majesty," he began. "I know." Taking the scroll from the footman's hands, Jocelyn, "are hereby notified that in regard to a certain glass slipper," as the Grand Duke continued to read, the footman held out a pillow covered by a cloth. "What's under it?" He pulled back the cloth with a flourish, revealing the dainty glass slipper. "Why, that's my slipper!" Drusilla shrieked, rushing forward. "What?" Anastasia cried. "Wait, well, I like that. It's my slipper!" Girls, their mother scolded. "Remember your manners." "1,000 pardons, Your Grace," she said to the Grand Duke. The Grand Duke cleared his throat again and read on. As Lady Tremaine listened intently, Gus and Jacques cautiously climbed up the table next to her and inched their way toward the pocket of her skirt, which contained the key to Cinderella's room. Jacques teetered on the edge of the table, and with Gus holding on to his tail, he lowered himself down into the pocket. "Now, let us proceed with the fitting," the Grand Duke said at last. "Of course," Lady Tremaine agreed. "Anastasia, dear," she called, motioning the girl to a chair. Anastasia daintily pulled back the hem of her dress, and the footman slid the slipper right onto her bare foot. "There," Anastasia said triumphantly. "I knew it was my slipper. It's exactly my size. I always wear the same size." I think she's pulling a trick. Do you see what was on that pillow under the cover? The glass slipper. Do you spot the glass slipper? Her voice trailed off as the footman lifted Anastasia's foot and more of the dress fell back. revealing the tiny slipper tangling off one of her huge toes. "Oh, well," said Anastasia, her face turning red. "It may be a trifle snug today. You know how it is, dancing all night. It always fits perfectly before." But no matter how she pushed, she could not force her large, knobbly foot into the dainty slipper. "Are you sure you're trying it on the right foot?" her mother asked, bending over to help. As she did so, Jock and the key came tumbling out of her pocket and onto the floor with a clank. Luckily, Anastasia and her mother were so busy struggling with the shoe that they didn't even notice. Staggering under the weight of the heavy key, Jacques and Gus headed for the stairs. "I don't think you're half trying," Anastasia said to the footman. "Next, please," the Duke commanded, pointing to Drusilla. By the time they reached the top of the long, steep stairway leading up to Cinderella's room, Jacques and Gus were more exhausted than they had ever been in their lives, but they knew they had to free their friend from her room before the Grand Duke left. Her future and her happiness depended on it. Cinderella heard a sound on the landing outside her room. She peeked through the keyhole and immediately stopped crying, for there, just outside the door, were two little mice and one big brass key. Cinderella's face lit up with a smile when she saw Jacques squirm under the door, but the smile quickly faded when she saw and heard a loud crash from outside. Peering through the keyhole, she saw Lucifer smiling smugly. He had Gus and the key trapped under a glass bowl. "Lucifer, let him go," she pleaded. "Please let him go." Jacques squeezed under the door. He rolled up his sleeves and bravely faced his foe. "Let him out," he squeaked, baring his teeth. Before the cat could respond, Jacques grabbed his black furry tail and bit down hard. Lucifer shot up the ground in surprise and pain, his paws clawing at the air. But before Jacques could free Gus, Lucifer fell back down again and grabbed the bowl. Within seconds, a whole army of Cinderella's friends came to the rescue. Mice hurled folks like spears at the sneaky cat. Birds flew overhead, dropping dishes on his head. But despite their best efforts, Gus and the key remained trapped. "Bruno! Get Bruno!" Cinderella cried through the keyhole. Two bluebirds flew off to find the dog. A moment later, Bruno came charging up the stairs. That did it. Lucifer took one look and ran for his life. As soon as the coast was clear, three of the strongest mice lifted the glass bowl and freed Gus. Then Jacques and Gus picked up the key once more and dragged it under the door into Cinderella's room. How many birds are in the picture? And how many mice? Chapter 12. "Of all the stupid idiots!" Drusilla screamed as a footman struggled to fit the glass slipper onto her gigantic foot. "I'll do it myself. I'll make it fit." She grabbed the shoe out of the footman's hands. After moaning and groaning and squeezing and squishing and bending, Drusilla finally managed to cram her foot into the slipper. "There!" she exclaimed, triumphantly holding her foot out for inspection. "It fits," the Grand Duke said in surprise. But suddenly Drusilla's tortured toes uncoiled. The too tight slipper slipped off her foot and flew straight up into the air. The Grand Duke and the footman both lunged to catch the fragile slipper. They bumped into each other and crashed to the floor. Just the glass shoe came plunging down to earth. Spread out flat on the floor, the Grand Duke reached out his hand and caught the slipper on the tip of one finger. "Oh, Your Grace, I'm dreadfully sorry," Lady Tremaine said, gazing down at the Grand Duke in horror. "It won't happen again." "Precisely, madam," the Grand Duke replied. He caught that slipper just in time. From his awkward position on the floor, he stood up and brushed himself off. "You're the only young ladies of the household, I hope? I presume," he said to Anastasia and Drusilla. "There's no one else, Your Grace," Lady Tremaine assured him. "In that case, then, good day," the Grand Duke said. He was eager to leave his unpleasant household. He was just ready to get out of there. "In that case." But just as he turned to go, a gentle voice called out from the top of the stairs, "Your Grace, please wait." All eyes turned to Cinderella, who was hurrying down the stairs. "May I try it on?" she asked. "Pay no attention to her," Lady Tremaine told the Grand Duke. "It's only Cinderella." "Our scurrilly maid," Anastasia explained. "From the kitchen," Drusilla added. But the Grand Duke was not listening to the stepfamily anymore. "Come, my child," he said to Cinderella kindly, taking her by the hand and leading her to a chair. As soon as she was seated, the footman came running with the slipper. Suddenly, an evil smile crossed Cinderella's stepmother's face. When the footman was only a few steps away from Cinderella, Lady Tremaine struck out a cane and tripped him. The footman and the slipper went flying, and the footman fell to the floor with a thud, and the slipper shattered into a million bits of broken glass on the floor at Cinderella's feet. "Oh, no," the Grand Duke cried out, falling to his knees and staring at the shards in disbelief. "This is terrible. What will the king say?" Lady Tremaine smiled smugly. This time, she was sure she had put Cinderella in her place. For good, Jocelyn. For good. "Perhaps," Cinderella spoke softly, "if it would help." No, the Grand Duke moaned. "Nothing can help now." "But you see," Cinderella said, "I have the other slipper." She pulled the other glass slipper out of her pocket and handed it to the Grand Duke, while Lady Tremaine and her daughters looked on in shock. The Grand Duke grabbed the precious slipper and kissed it. He smiled at Cinderella and gently slid the dainty slipper onto her foot. It fit perfectly, of course. And both Cinderella and the Grand Duke laughed with delight. Cinderella held up her foot, admiring the tiny, perfect slipper sparkling in the light. She didn't even notice her stepfamily's jealous skulls. The face of her gentle, handsome prince filled her mind, and her heart brimmed over with the knowledge that she would never be unhappy again. The bells of the palace clock tower chimed merrily as Cinderella and the prince ran from the church. Two chirping bluebirds held up the train of Cinderella's beautiful white wedding gown, and she smiled at the townspeople who had gathered to see the happy couple. The well-wishers showered the newlyweds with rice as they ducked into their honeymoon coach. The whole kingdom seemed to aglow with love and goodwill. Cinderella turned to her new husband, holding his hand tightly as the coach carried them off to begin their new life together. Cinderella thought only of good things. I know. Good things. She thought of her happy night time she had shared with her father. She thought of her faithful animal friends at the chateau. She thought of the kind, friendly godmother who had made her new life possible. She thought of her lovely prince, with whom she would live in happiness and harmony all the days of their lives. And finally, as the prince leaned over to kiss his new bride, Cinderella suddenly thought of how she had learned never ever to give up on your dreams or hers. That's it. It's over. Now, Jocelyn, if you've noticed, loves to grab her hair and mess it up. And she smiles about it too. So that's a lot of fun things you'll see a lot during story time. Her grabbing her head and her hair and playing with it. Well, that's it for this week. So hope you had a great time listening to the story of Cinderella. Next week will be the last week of June, and it'll be the last princess story, and we'll be honoring Princess Jasmine from the story of Aladdin. So I hope you will join us next week for that, and have a blessed weekend.